And, we do all sorts of things. We make short documentary films. We go into the basements of courthouses and scan in old school records. We have a community history database. We do GIS mapping, everything that we can think of to get our hands on helping weave together this Black narratives in the region. But today, a more popular component of the Black and Appalachian Project is the Black and Appalachian Podcast, which is why you guys are here today. The Black and Appalachian Podcast is produced by East Tennessee PBS and distributed by PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. You can get it on all of your podcast platforms. And this particular program is part of the Black Ecologies Week here at the University of Tennessee in partnership with the Humanities Center and Africana Studies and a couple other things. The Bottom, which is a Black-owned bookstore in East Knoxville. So if you're interested in buying some books from a Black-owned bookstore, or buttons or shirts or having tea or having a place to work, you can do that in East Knoxville on Magnolia Avenue. And the Bottom is also selling Drew's book, Home Place, in the back. So if you want to take the Home Place home with you, you can do that too. It's support the Bottom. But today we're going to talk with Dr. J. Drew Lanham. He's a native of Edgefield, South Carolina. Mr. Lanham is the author of The Home Place, Memoirs of a Colored Man's Love Affair with Nature, which I highly recommend, and also Sparrow Envy, produced by a publishing house out of Spartanburg, South Carolina. What's the name of that? Hub City in Spartanburg, South Carolina, which is a really cool publishing house. The Home Place received the Reed Award from the Southern Environmental Law Center and the Southern Book Prize and was a finalist for the John Burroughs Medal. Mr. Lanham is a birder, a naturalist, a hunter conservationist who has published essays and poetry in publications including Orion, Audubon, Flycatcher, Wilderness, and several anthologies, including The Colors of Nature, State of the Heart, Bartram's Living Legacy, Carolina Writers at Home, and an alumni distinguished professor of wildlife ecology and master teacher at Clemson University. He and his family live in the upstate of South Carolina. A soaring hawk's downhill glide from the Southern Appalachian escarpment that the Cherokee once called the Blue Wall. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the Black and Appalachian Podcast.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out today. This is really exciting to see you all. I looked out the window and I was like, pumpkin running by her folks. Glad to see y'all. I'm Kesha O'Neill. I'm a sociologist of race and place and Black Appalachian experiences.
I am Pumpkin Star. I'm a land and place organizer, lover, musician, creative. I do lots of things. I also hold down the Bottom within Keshi, and happy to be here.
We spent a lot of time together.
We do.
And we're excited to do this, to have this conversation today with you.
Yeah.
Drew, how are you feeling today?
I'm feeling great. Thank you for having me on the podcast here in Knoxville. And thank you to the Bottom for representing, really. It's and this program, Black Ecologies, Black in Appalachia, it feels good to be represented, to be respected, to be seen. So thank you. To be heard.
A lot of what we're about, visibility, also showing the different shades and spectrums of being Black in Appalachia. So yeah,
For sure.
appreciate you seeing us.
Amen.
Amen. Amen. Well, you know, when we speak of Appalachian differences, right? When we think about Appalachia, we think of many different Appalachians, right? And certainly South Carolina, I think, is a space that is often excluded from what is Appalachia, right? So can you tell us a little bit about your Appalachia?
Yeah, you know, we are, South Carolina is many things. I think Mark Twain met someone on a riverboat, of course, at one point, and was a South Carolinian. He said from that meeting, he deemed South Carolina to be the state most likely to cut off his nose despite his face. So South Carolina is many things, and sociopolitically, it's that. But then from an ecological standpoint, we have this tiny sliver of the Southern Appalachians. That's the escarpment that, again, the Cherokee once called the Blue Wall. And so it's our smallest physiographic province. Maximum elevation is only about 3,600 feet at Sassafras Mountain. So we don't even get into spruce fir. See, if I'm gonna go to war, I'm gonna go to war with North Carolina to get some of their spruce fir. And, and a little more, than a few more ruffed grouse and golden winged warblers. But on the real, it's it's called the upcountry, but the old name for that portion of the state in Oconee, Pickens, Greenville, and a little bit of Spartanburg was called the Dark Corner. The Dark Corner. Now, the Better Business Bureau has changed that now in Oconee County. It's called the Golden Corner. But it was called the Dark Corner in part because that was the place where Scots-Irish primarily could escape, right? It was way above the fall line. There was very little industry there. People were living back in hollers and making do in that way. So yeah, it's on the edge of it, of Appalachia and the escarpment. But really, a lot of people in South Carolina don't know a whole lot about it. And it more recently, in the, I guess, 60s, 70s, but especially the 80s, 90s, and to now, it's become better known because of all the hydroelectric lakes. So Lake Jocassee, Kiowee, Hartwell, that subsumed lots of communities during inundation. So over this way, y'all would think about TVA. Over our way, we think about Duke Power, right? And what that meant in the core, and what that meant. So you know, our story is in some ways similar, but lesser known because it's on the edge. And because it's on the edge and not in the heart of Appalachia, it means that there are issues that get forgotten, including our presence in these places. So, you know, one of the most famous places, at least for Black folk in South Carolina, would be Little Liberia in Pickens County, and Soapstone Church. And that's in Pumpkin Town, South Carolina, right? Pumpkin Town, right? You know, I have to get in and out of my truck quickly to steal that sign for you, but you know, it is when I came to Clemson back in the mid '80s, which sounds ancient, you know, people were telling me, well, you're gonna go up there, you're gonna get hanged. You don't go up there, you don't go into that neck of the woods, so to speak. You know, so it's an unknown place on the edge, most famously, I guess, from kind of a pop culture standpoint, a good bit of Deliverance was filmed there, which has an impact on people, right? I tell folks that, you know, watch too much Deliverance and you'll be scared to go anywhere up here. Some of it, justifiably so. But it's that corner, that dark corner, and sort of the mystery behind it, people not knowing, people making assumptions about it. And then they're going to make a whole different set of assumptions about the majority that's up there. But then when it comes to Black folk in a place that people don't think we are or should be, then the narrative really gets narrow. So living in that narrow sliver and having that narrow narrative that even I am still learning about, like Soapstone or these other sort of small enclaves, Seneca, which is where we live. Seneca, South Carolina, is still classified as being in Appalachia. And so when we talk about social funding and those kinds of things, it reaches down there. But here you got an edge of Appalachia town where Black folk were attorneys, physicians, surgeons, dentists. At a point in time when folks would come out of one of the sundown towns, they would go into non-segregated offices because guess what? The professionals were Black. odd, right? And so the power that you see in places like Greenville now, a lot of that political power came out of Seneca, or at least from, that generation of the 60s and 70s. So judges and the like. So most people don't know. Most people, South Carolina is Charleston and Myrtle Beach, right? And they're like, oh, do you know so-and-so in Charleston? No, I'm up here. So to have the opportunity to talk on the edge of a place and to have come to love it as I do, in so many ways, but also struggle with it as I do. Because it does, it has a history that's not so sweet. That when you consider a place that was always very, very white after it was occupied by indigenous peoples, that you work hard in some of these places to make sure that it's lily, that you say, you know what, by sundown, y'all need to be out. That was still going on in people's minds in the 80s, late 80s. So when I started working, people said, well, you need to be out. You're going where? I'm going to say, I'm going up to Salem. They're like, well, you need to make sure you're out of Salem by sundown. And I remember the first time I heard that, I had never heard of a sundown town before. And went up there to work and didn't think a whole lot about it until I was working the landscaping crew. We needed to get some gas for a mulcher. And I was heading out in the truck to get it. And this dude ran me down, stopped me and said, whoa, whoa, whoa. I need to go with you. And that's like 88, 89. So that's not that long ago, of being on the edge of this place. Now people say, oh, see, that's why I told you not to go up there. But see, I can go down to Midlands and pick out a place in Lexington County and say, oh yeah, but y'all shouldn't be here. We're down in the low country to find the same thing. So when you have a tiny sliver of something, anything within it is sort of concentrated by virtue of that volume. Likewise, the influences from the outside, it's sort of insular in a way. So I'm constantly thinking about that sliver of a place, of what it means ecologically. I'm an ecologist, so I think about all of the species that come down to that edge and really go no further because it's just not right for them below that. But then I also think about the people, from the Cherokee to those Scots-Irish who pushed in there and sometimes lived peacefully, but mostly not. And then Black folk and how we found our way there, sometimes brought, sometimes to go by choice, and sort of the complexity of it all. And now really take a lot of pride in being a part of this place that people don't think I should be, maybe think I should be a part of, or at the very least say, well, why would you be up there? And then that gives us the opportunity, again, that's a sort of, as Sister Bell Hooks would say, that's a sort of resistance to write about it, to be in a place and to take pride in it and to speak truth to it in those ways. So you guys give us further opportunity to leverage that.
Think about that pride. I was talking to somebody just yesterday, and he was asking if I identify as Appalachian. And I said, well, I don't identify as Appalachian, but I'm Black in Appalachia, and that's a part of my identity now. And I have a sense of pride, and I'm protective of this place, and it's something that, talking to him about it, I was like, what is that? Why is that? Why do I have this pride of this place? And of course, we can think about, the exploitation of the place, exploitation of Black folks in general, and just kind of carrying that those histories in our beings, right? But can we talk a little bit about that pride for you? Like, what do you think about that?
Well, if you don't mind, I'm gonna share because, and I didn't anticipate any of this. Well, I anticipated coming here.
Yeah.
But I grabbed a couple of things on the way out, and if you haven't, some of you may know Brent Martin. He's a great friend who is down in Franklin, around Franklin, North Carolina. But Brent has written several books. This one is called The Changing Blue Ridge Mountains, Essays on Journeys Past and Present. And in his chapter, when the heart can no longer say home, his epigraph is, the day will arrive when those afflicted people will not only have full satisfaction for their oppressions, but dreadful, irrevocable wrath, when they will be masters and either enslave or exterminate them, their masters and oppressors, unless ye speedily take measures to do them justice by giving them liberty, freedom, thus natural and political right equal to our own maxims and solemn acts and promises in the face of heaven. Now, that comes from William Bartram, who we are familiar with, especially in South Carolina, a little bit in North Carolina, right? North Carolina mountains, in 1783. So Oconee Bells, for example, and maybe not Oconee Bells as much, but certain the ecology of South Carolina comes through him. And so in Brent, in talking about this and talking about Appalachia, he's up in Philadelphia, where Bartram had this museum. And he talks about sort of this man of the late 18th century who had this feeling about indigenous peoples, but also enslaved peoples, enslaved Black people. And he goes on later, and this to your point of pride, Barry Lopez, who many of you may be familiar with. Barry Lopez writes, Brent says, that the effort to know a place deeply is an expression of the human desire to belong, and that the determination to know a place is consistently rewarded. What I appreciate is his insistence that every place is open to being known. And somewhere in this process, a person begins to sense that they themselves are becoming known, so that when they are absent from that place, they know that place misses them. That's powerful. And this reciprocity to know and be known reinforces a sense that one is necessary in the world. Now, that sends chills. I mean, that, Brent is interpreting Barry Lopez there, but that whole idea of being in a place and knowing. So as a naturalist, you know the soil, you know the ground, you know the plants and the animals, the patterns of weather. And you become comfortable in that place. You know that place. And then this reciprocity begins to happen. So, I'm born in the Midlands, but here I am, Black in Appalachia, and calling myself a Black Appalachian, right? I wasn't born here, but I feel reborn in many instances here in ways. So I've had, to think about what home is and what we call home and how place attaches itself to us as much as we attach ourselves to a place. And, it takes a while. Sometimes it takes, sometimes it doesn't. And for a long time, a large part of what would not take in me was sort of this fear of it. Well, I don't know what's over that ridge. Or to be out and somebody say, well, of course you know where the sundown town is. or somebody referred to something as a hanging tree. Well, what does that mean? Well, you know what it means. But then to educate yourself and to understand where you are and that protest that Bell Hooks talks about and that reciprocity that Lopez talks about, that Brent explains, comes through in this protest. You know what? This place claims me, I'm gonna claim it. So I used to have this code. I would say, okay, after I see so many of those kinds of flags, not, you know, and at some point I had to give a single finger salute and say, no, I'm not gonna be stupid, right? I'm not going up in the middle of some encampment. But I am gonna say, you know what? I have as much right to be in this place as you do. I remember being up in Bluefield. Y'all know where Bluefield is?
Which one?
Bluefield, West Virginia. And my wife and I rode up there and at night. And so here you are winding back into these places. This was along the Elkhorn. And you can't see. And driving through these towns, and I mean, I was okay with it because I was thinking about some other, she was thinking about some other stuff too. But I remember the next day coming back down to Bluefield, and I saw these people that didn't look anything like I expected people to look like in Bluefield. Like, what are these Black people doing here? And then you get down, and then you've got a historically Black college, like in West Virginia. Didn't indigenous people avoid West Virginia? Because, I mean, parts of it was too rough. But then that knowing of this place and learning about this place, but then learning that history of bringing in Black folks to be scabs, to break in coal mines, you know, and everybody, you know, a lot of people know, you know, stories of a few people. But again, that was to me inspiring because I'm like, look, we are everywhere and we can claim everywhere. So that's the very long answer to that question, and that there's a reciprocity. We claim land by deed and title, legacy, but then for the land to claim us and to feel that, when you feel that in your marrow bone, that to me is a sort of, that's a sort of call to action that you hold on to it. And that's where part of my reparation comes from, because look, you're not gonna push me out just because, and we've had a history of that, people saying, well, you don't need to be here. And you look at 1919 and those times when towns, when some of these sundown towns were created, and people were given 30 days, y'all need to be out of here and never come back. Well, I'm one person, but I want to seek to change that narrative such that narrow sliver of South Carolina that hasn't been occupied by us in certain ways, but has been, to let people know. There's scholars who study Little Liberia. Y'all have heard of that place, right? The Soapstone Church in Pumpkintown, South Carolina. Look it up. Dr. Mike Coggeshall is a sociologist who's done a lot of that work. People were trying to claim that Soapstone Church for the longest. It was a freedmen's community in Pickens County, South Carolina. And Soapstone Church, up until I think right before COVID, was still having Friday fish fries. In the 60s, it was burned down by the Klan and rebuilt by the community, not just the Black folks, and people recognize the importance of it. But again, for the South Carolina upcountry, for the dark corner, Little Liberia, really? And so when I found out about it, I was like, oh, so there has been this presence. There have been people in this very rich valley in Pumpkintown, of all places. So, my brother moving up to not a sundown town, but a town called Sunset. I'm like, man, you crazy? Really? You're gonna move up? Sunset, that's close, right? But then the little road that I live on now is called Mountain Sunset Trail. where I have my little cabin. So, to me, that was sort of a sign that I need to protest, that I need to stick to this ground that I claim, and that now it's beginning to claim me in a way. So I think Lopez is right. I certainly think that Brent's interpretation of that is right. So you are Black in Appalachia, and you stay here long enough, you know, soil, those molecules, those atoms begin to work their way through you. And I think that's true of wherever we go, wherever we are, for good or bad, that happens to us.
I'm going a whole different direction, but I'm gonna stick to script.
It's like I'm particularly thinking about, that's my route to liberating myself, was belonging to land and honing into that practice of belonging to it and it not belonging to me. It was my whole path of like economic justice, learning about capitalism, just that when I set it in my mind of like, we belong to it. It doesn't belong to us. Everything about buying it and partitioning it, it made no sense. It made no sense after that. And then also knowing that, you know, we were meant to work this land for someone else's profit of it. So it was definitely a path of liberation for me. So I definitely loved hearing you say that. You say it so beautifully. So yeah.
Well, I think, you know, we recognize, so we can recognize land, the value of it, whatever, our history on it, the natural history of it. Then we reconcile our relationships, all those things, to our history, to relationships with birds and beasts and soil, because that soil is still under our fingernails. I don't care how much you brush, it's still there. But then the reparation comes when you claim it and don't wait for somebody to give it to you. They may owe it to you all day, but I've decided that I'm going to take it. And by taking, I mean letting it claim me. And so in becoming a part of it in that way, and Lopez and Martin talk about legacy, that ultimately some legacy is left behind physically or spiritually in a way that you are recognized as being a part, and it is recognized as being a part of you. And so that, you know, there are powerful images of us and thinking about it. And one of the things I'm looking forward to doing in this program is just learning more about our ecologies here. And then, you know, Brent's invited me up to, you know, the Colorway, because there's a whole deal going on there down around Western Carolina and in Franklin and see, and I have stuff to get over there because I abandoned a research project that I write about. My first research project I abandoned, that was above Franklin, because it was an enclave, had become an enclave for white supremacists. And I'm like, and it was what, a few miles from my study site, and these people were shooting in effigy Black and brown people. And I'm thinking, oh, I'm gonna go up there and watch birds. Right, and I remember going to my advisor and saying, I can't do this, not there. And he advised me that I needed to be armed, and so I changed research sites. And maybe last year, year before last, I saw where it was one of the sites where that Tubman statue was being, in Colorway, I think it was, right, in Franklin, or around there, and that the Tubman statue was there. And what that statue told me, and people bringing it there, that was very powerful in having Harriet Tubman's image in this place is to me the ultimate image of freedom and independence and courage. And so that is helping me work through even that old fear of this place. And plus, I'm too old now to let the damn flag dictate where I go, because that's the intent. And that's hard.
It is, and I'm thinking about so many different things related to this, right? And I think, so one, I'm imagining that you've come across this multiple times in your career, right? That this is a regular occurrence that you come up to sundown towns and flags and camps and all kinds of BS, right? That has to, and I get the strength and the resistance and just like my presence here is so much, right? And Harriet's statue being there is also so much, but that's still a lot, right? That's still a lot. I'm thinking about I'm thinking about your family. We have a question around this too, and I'm gonna quickly ask the question, but I just wanna preface it with some of like these thoughts, right? Like you said that your brother moved nearby or some sunset town. Do you have kids and what is?
Yeah, the town he moved to is Sunset, which it's funny. So you think about Highway 11. Highway 11 is Cherokee Foothills Highway. So it's the mountain highway in South Carolina, basically. 178 winds up at Cashers, which Cashers also has a history. And when he was up there, I would go up to see him. Well, before that, I had worked up in that area as a wildlife biologist. And so I had come to know it. And, I would hear banjos, right? Being followed on a road because I'm a black man in a truck with a white woman, and wondering if I'm going to get out that day. And then coming back down to my then fiance and never really talking about a lot of that. Because as a wildlife biologist, you're not supposed to be afraid to go anywhere. Because guess what? People hear that and they say, well, you're not a real biologist anyway. We knew that you weren't going to be able to do this work. So I never really talked about that to people, really until I began to write about it. So, my brother had a different kind of courage initially than I did. And again, he was sort of an exemplar in saying, well, he liked being there, so he was going to be there. And it took a few years for that to sink in. And then I know another black biologist named Richard Morton. And Richard has always been a role model for me because we're the same age basically, but Richard eventually came to be the sort of the chief of that area. And so he was working up in some of these places and had to get to know these people and they knew him. And so you would have these exemplars that were lighting these pathfinders that were lighting the path before you. And you look at them and you say, well, I can do that. But why would I? Why would I? And that's when the land's claim on you comes in. Because if I'm standing up on Caesar's Head or I'm hiking in Table Rock or I'm in Jocassee Gorges, jumping off rock or somewhere like that, and I look out, you know what? At that moment of looking out over that landscape, over forests, and trees, and water, and peaks, and all this stuff, and say, you know what? I feel like I'm a part of this. And that's powerful, to feel grounded in that way, and to feel connected. And so, people do vows and stuff in matrimony, and they talk about not letting any man put a relationship asunder. Well, I have that relationship to land. So, or I try to. And if it claims me and I claim it, then we have a relationship that I'm gonna work towards. So, no, and I'll tell you, even in the little place that I am now, there's a little encampment on the other side of the ridge. And it's just sort of curious to me, because at certain times they put up flagpoles, and this was after January 6th, and I was like, huh, that's curious. And then you see like an American flag, and you see a Gadsden flag, and you see a Confederate flag, and you see a flag with a certain person's name. I was like, oh. And so at that point, I had the same feelings that started coming back. And I also started carrying my 357. Look, you know, because even because at one point, my wife had asked, "Are you carrying?" I'm like, "No, I don't." And I was like, "For what?" And then I was like, "Oh." So for a while I was, right. And I remember one day coming around the corner and seeing those flags up. And it's like, look, if I walk up the ridge through the holler, it's right there. And for a while I had this feeling of again, looking over my shoulder. I'm tired of that. I really am just tired of it. It's exhausting. Y'all know. It could be on the street. You know, you get tired of having, look, I could identify a Crown Vic, but seriously. Now it's Chargers, Dodge Chargers, right? How they roll, how they ride, the lights, and all that. Well, that's exhausting to have to roll that way. And part of freedom is being able to keep your eyes ahead, or look at the birds you want to see, or look at the ground, and breathe without this. So I came around that curve one day. It wasn't a prayer exactly that I said, because I said, yeah, y'all, but not so kindly. And I downshifted and I kept going. And I got around my little placement, and at that point it was almost like the ceremony between me and that teeny tiny piece of land. I said, I belong here. And that land, every time I'm on it, says, yeah, you do. You breathe differently when you're up here. Your mind is in a different place. So I think that family and friends understand some of those risks. But you know, it'd be nice for us to not have to deal with that. And people don't understand that's a different sort of, it's like constantly worrying as a bird whether there's a hawk circling. And you can never sing as freely when you're, you know, worried in that way. So.
And that's what we talked about for just preparing to talk to you was, you know, first we were just kind of, you know, lost in the romanticism, like reading your book and just being like, oh, that's grandmama. And like, you know, but then, you know, we were at the bottom and like, someone, like one of our homies was just like it's dangerous to love nature and be Black. Like it's dangerous, you know, like we just started kind of shouting out the names and the instances and thinking about you with birds. We immediately started thinking about Central Park Karen. Central Park Karen, and like, and so, and like, people who just went to hunt, you know, and it was lethal. People who it was lethal. People who went to just be outside and was invited. So I really appreciate how you are speaking to, it's not even a duality, it's just kind of it's a complex, like, of it. It's like, but it would be nice it's not even nice, it's crucial that we can just be outside, because also nature is just when we step outside. Nature's in here, you know what I mean? Like, just to be and not feel like it's dangerous. So I really appreciate how you more spoke of like a practice versus having that either or, because we don't get to have the privilege of it.
Well, that, you said practice?
Yeah, the practice of belonging, yeah.
Yeah, and it is. It's no one-time thing that you say, oh, now it's all good. If you remember back, I think it was 2008, and like on a November night when it was declared post-racial. Y'all remember that? Oh, people were so quick. Oh, wow, look at this. Here we are. We all wondered when that moment of post-racial would happen. And here we are. This night, it's all good. Right. And so it is a practice that daily, and maybe part of what happens is, instead of having to do that, we grow these eyes in the back of our heads. And you begin to feel, and you can feel and say, okay, well, all right, I need to slow down here. I need to so-and-so. So it's not that I'm any sort of person who has laid all of my fears aside. I can tell you, it's I go way down the hill into the Midlands and again into Lexington County, South Carolina, which you look, I make a regular practice of looking at the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate map. That's a range map, y'all. And I'm like, oh, if I drive through that place, I want to make sure that I get through there before it's too late. So that's still an exercise in limitation and thinking, but it's a practice. And I don't give up wisdom or my life for being foolhardy brave. But I am also going to stand on my ground when it has claimed me, when we have that reciprocal relationship, then that's the practice. So I love that word because that's what life is. It's practicing the game at the same time. So it's this calculus that you go through. What am I risking to be here or to go there? And is it worth that cost benefit? And for me, at the end of the day, me being able to breathe in a certain way, me being able to feel that freedom. And that's what it feels like. When you ask what it feels like to be in a place that you are willingly bound to, not forced to be bound to. That is a very different feeling. So it's funny because when I picked up Brent's book today, because I was running out of the house, running out of a little thicket, and I picked it up, and it fell open to that. It fell open to that. And so what it tells me is y'all are doing something powerful. Because again, this is so outside of the narrative. And I remember the first time, I talked to Stacy and then I met Will and I'm like, what is this Black and Appalachian thing? What is this? Who are these people? And I was up in Tomasi is where I'm gonna place it. And I don't even know why I had on the Black and Appalachian shirt that day. It's not like it was a purposeful commercial, but I had the big hat. And before I leave, often what I'll do is, I do the social media thing and I've taken this picture and I saw it and felt empowered. and it's funny what that does. And so I wanted to thank you guys for that, because that was empowering to me in this way that was like, oh, you mean it mattered that I had it here, and it does. So what you're doing with the podcast, and its intention, belonging. And people can say, oh, well, you're not supposed to be up there. Why would you do that? And so you're hitting in ways, I'm sure maybe you're aware of it, but it's impacted me very, very deeply. So I'm grateful for it.
You know, every time make me cry.
No, we're supposed to be gassing you up, you know?
No, but that means a lot. That means a lot for us, you know. I don't want to go too far down that alley, but it does. And again, like, I'm not from this area, right? But I am here, and the stories that I hear, the people that we meet, all of this just I don't take it light. You know, we don't take this stuff lightly. This is you know, this guy's been doing this forever. You know what I mean? So it's just to hear how people receive our work and to receive Black in Appalachia. You good in my book.
You know, again, it is, you said it's complex, and people would set us up as a duality, anything that we do. And it is complex. I tell people all the time, one of the stories I love to tell is that as a kid, I always envied those kids who had the Crayola box of 64 with the sharpener at the back. And
Rich kid.
right, because my parents were like, those 8 crayons they give you in that little box. And then I got, then we would get the 24, but they were always like the knockoff Crayolas. And then I finally got a box of 48. And I made a mistake and left them in the back of the car window, and I got back, and it was a candle, right? Beautiful candle. But those hues, right? Those hues of what it is of who it is that we are collectively, but then individually, the crayons that we can be that have not been described in any box, that we can color and be on any landscape, and to be up on a ridge or down in a holler or hiking along a hogback or wherever it is that you are in that space, to feel like you are part of that box of uncountable crayons. That's a powerful thing. And giving voice to that is what y'all are doing with this. And so it was, the more I thought about just having the opportunity to be a part of it, it made the drive over much shorter. Thank you.
Thank you. Look at that. We didn't win so far. I mean, it's great, though. I mean, now I don't even know where to come back,
I
right?
wanna dip a little bit into birds. I was thinking while you were talking, I was like, Black in Appalachia is also commemoration, how we find each other and live together.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, oh yeah, talk about birds with you, So yeah, why birds? You study a lot, but yeah.
Flight and song, and both are representative of freedom and choice. And in that way, I talk frequently. I have a friend, John Lane, down in Spartanburg, and we write about nature a lot. But for me, it always comes back down to birds. And birds they're not just metaphor, but they're allegory. And I mean, for generations, our people, Black folks have looked to the sky, but all people have looked to the sky for birds, right? Because here they are seemingly defying what keeps us bound to the ground. I mean, we understand that gravity is still acting on them, right? But how do you surpass? I mean, if you just stand and look, I was, as Jeff was picking me up, there was a flock of cedar waxwings that was flying from tree to tree. And those birds always stop me because they're very social. They're always communicating. If you stop and watch cedar waxwings, inevitably you're going to see one bird pass a piece of fruit or a food item to another bird. And you can hear them always in conversation. But then those birds take off and they're together and go into this next place. And there's a certain comfort in that, but that those birds are making decisions collectively, sharing resources, but going where it is that they choose to go. So, that to me is a beautiful thing. It, as I write oftentimes, I still try sometimes to be a bird. I don't jump off of things, but like I did as a kid, my bones would not handle that now. My skeletal system is a little aged, but what I do is with words that I write to try to sing in some way, with poetry to try to get others to fly. It helps me escape sort of harsh realities of life. And, I've said, as I've written, that joy is the justice we give ourselves. So a bird is joy to me. As long as a bird can fly freely, sing, choose where it wants to be, and is not hampered by us, then that's joy. So I study them for that reason, because it's hard unless, and even as I think about extinct birds, I imagine the joy that they at least gave somebody at one time, but then I also see the sin of extinction as something that we can't keep repeating. So that murmuration, the birds that, blackbirds are known most, at least in this country, for murmurations. And it intrigues me, you can go on YouTube and other channels and you can see murmurations to music, right? And people cry.
Okay.
And then that bird close up has no legal protection. People can kill them without cause. Sound familiar? You can watch people play on a field, cheer them on, admire them for the prowess of their performance from afar, and then up close you can't stand them. So there's also that parallel that has me interested in birds in these ways that we can see them and we can learn from them. So every bird that I see is sort of inspiration for some story. Those waxwings, again, they were just there, and for just a brief moment, it's like, oh, and I know we're in the range of cedar waxwings. I mean, they're all over the east, they're all over the place. But every time I see them, there's just this joy in seeing cedar waxwings being cedar waxwings, and it reminds me that it's okay for me to be me, wherever I am.
Do you remember, a moment when this happened? Do you remember the moment as a child, or when you realized this thing, or when birds became your thing? Are there any stories around there,
You mentioned my grandmother.
Yes.
You mentioned Samantha, and she was the first person I ever saw feed birds, and she would take grits. Usually, Jim Dandy grits. I don't know if I remember that. I probably, at the time, I was probably jealous because I wouldn't get them. But she would take those grits out of the bag and she would throw them out in the backyard for the snowbirds, for juncos and sparrows. And that's because she said she would pity those birds when it was cold. So, you know, that was a part of her ornithology, or, you know, her being afraid of owls, because she said they were bad omen, and shooting a hole through the porch roof because she didn't want the owl in the arborvitae tree next to the house. Or if a bird got in the house, that meant death, right? And I didn't understand where that was coming. Y'all know how old that is? That's old. But then I started learning that parts of her ornithology were from her parents and their enslaved parents, but also there was indigenous culture that had mixed in there somewhere about some of this stuff. So that ornithology I live daily. You know, when I walk from my grandmother's house over to my parents across the pasture, you know, I would see what she called partridges, bobwhite quail, and all of these other birds, bee martins, which are eastern kingbirds. I learned to, you know, that time in the space between my grandmother's house, which was a wonderful time, but it was also sort of wrought with, you know, sort of my grandmother's fundamentalism, and sort of feeling closed in some ways. And then once I got to Mama and Daddy's house, you know, I was gonna have to share time and resources with my siblings, get beat up by them. And my parents were gonna have stuff for me to do and expectations. So the time between leaving my grandmother's house and walking to my parents' house and back and forth, that was freedom. And the birds were the most free, and you could always see them. So from the time that I could walk from Grandma Martha's house to Mom and Daddy's house and back and forth when I was probably, I don't know, you know, 6, 7 years old, that's when it took hold. And so, yeah, it just, you know, that was, and my parents always had books, and then I would save up for books. But again, people told me when I learned what an ornithologist was and decided that I wanted to be one, you know, people say, well, you know, Black people don't do that. Just like Black people don't live in the mountains. Just like Black people aren't cowboys. Just like Black people don't ride horses. Just like they do. You know, and we're learning all of these things, this limitlessness of who it is that we are. And birds are limitless. They traverse. I mean, a wandering albatross can go to sea and fly for years. You know, a swift sleeps in flight. A duck sleeps part of its brain. And yeah, a peregrine dives at close to 200 miles an hour. Birds traverse hemispheres, you know, and the only GPS talking to them is evolution. So, you know, I'm with anything that I can learn about birds, but even in what I can't ever know about birds, I love. I can't know how they think. I can't know what that sparrow thinks inside that thicket, but I can envy it for being the little brown bird that it is, that my grandmother fed with grits. So, you know, birds.
Where's some of the spots you want to reach and you want to go bird? Where are you going?
Well, you know, the Caesar's Head, which you come over 76 from Brevard, North Carolina. And there's a little park. If you're driving too fast, you'll miss it. You'll be down the hill too far to turn around and go back. But Caesar's Head is a place that I love to go because there are ravens there. And ravens are special birds. You know, they just, I mean, they're large, black, intelligent, playful, resourceful. That's what I want to be, right? So, so Caesar's Head is great. It's great for peregrine falcons. It's great for spring migrants and fall migrants. And you're standing there and you're looking out over the Piedmont. And one of the spectacular things is that you can hear bird song from the valley below you, and it just sort of drifts up. So that's one of the favorite places. Jocassee Gorges feels like Costa Rica in the spring and summer. You go down into those gorges, and that's one thing about the escarpments. You've got these deeply incised gorges that are unlike, you know, some of the other highlands, and so it's a place that you can go that's close by, that feels far away, and that's one of the things that this place does. It's one of those nearby, far away places. You know, you can gain elevation. The first golden eagle I ever saw wasn't out west; it was at Graveyard Fields on Blue Ridge Parkway. So, you know, there are lots of, you know, Devil's Courthouse. You go there and hear saw-whet owls. But I, you know, increasingly, and part of what COVID taught me, and I had got this little place up in Tomasi, excuse me, right before, you know, about a year and a half before COVID. And so as everything shut down, this was still a place that I could go and be sequestered. And what I learned of that little less than an acre that has my name on it, but who has my name in it, were the birds that would come through in the spring. And to imagine that hooded warbler that was singing on my ridge, you know, a few weeks before had been somewhere in Central America, that the scarlet tanager that I heard singing way up in the yellow poplar had been in the Amazon with jaguars and harpy eagles. And so those little spots, I've learned during these plagues of both, I was up there watching birds. When George Floyd. So, you know, in that instance, I recognized my privilege to do what I do in that place. So, you know, I always come back to, I think of life as an experiment. Home is the control. Where we travel is the experiment. And we're always comparing stuff to home. And I have been some absolutely wonderful places to see some absolutely fantastic things. But then I always come back home and I'm like, okay. So it's not as much there, it's not as high, it's not as this, it's not as that. But it's the ground that claims me and the ground that I claim. And the birds that come through are gracing me with their presence from all over the place. So if I only see 6 or 12 versus 200, I'm good with that. Good with that. So that's kind of my place.
I was waiting for one of us to ask, like, can we kick it?
Yes.
Can we come do some bird watching?
Yes. Yeah.
Can we go, Dad?
Let's do that.
Yeah.
You know.
Okay.
We'll talk. You know, one of the things that you know, when I come up through this area, and when you think about the Appalachians ecologically, and all the water that flows through here, it's also like a river of life. You know, the birds that are flowing up the Appalachian chain back and forth. And if you just envision at night as you're sleeping, and even now, these birds are streaming back up from the Caribbean, from Central and South America. And they're streaming back up these Appalachians, and you know that people have learned from them over time the ways to go. Even though they couldn't be in the sky, they could say, okay, well, what's below these birds when they land? It's that people have taken their cues from them. So I think about that a lot. I haven't birded a lot in Tennessee, but a good bit in Western North Carolina. And the thing is, you talked about wildness or outside, the nature stories. You know, let's find a place in Knoxville to go. Let's find a place that's out to go. But wherever we go, you know, to be there as proudly and as boldly as we can be in that space. And that's, again, part of what I'm learning. And as I write about range maps, and I mentioned that before, in the past, I've written a whole lot about limitation. And I realized that I was, in writing about my limitation, that I was becoming self-limited. And so in that, to learn how to say, okay, you know what, wildness isn't just out west or in the middle of, you know, something that people call wilderness. Wildness is in that place that something is not in your control. Something in nature is not in your control. So we go to that space and we learn it and we feel it and we take from it what we can in our heads and hearts, and birds will be a part of that. So, you know, let's talk about how we can collaborate on that kind of thing, because this is the time of year when, I mean, whippoorwills are coming back through. And so, you know, when you hear those birds, I mean, they tell you that the seasons have turned. You know, swallows are back. Louisiana water thrushes are beginning to move up the creeks and into the hollers. Heard a barred owl calling the other day. And that's a bird that Harriet, that woo, 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 she was using that. Yeah.
Thinking about that movement is so interesting too, right? Like the birds moving and the people moving. We talk a lot about moving through Appalachia, Black folks moving through the region, from other places through the region, moving out of the region, but also moving within the region. I'm even thinking about, like, you mentioned about the birds that come up from the Amazon. Like, I'm here from Guyana, right? Like, and I think about that movement and how that parallels. That's interesting. When you take people out, and I'm assuming you take people out because you're a professor and you take students out. When you take people out, what are you trying to facilitate? You know, when we go on our excursions.
Yeah.
What are you facilitating in those spaces?
Connection.
Yeah.
And so it's, you know, I talk a lot about people want to go out to identify birds. I want to take people out to identify with birds. So that not only are we learning field marks, but we're learning field marks. That we're getting some idea and some, not just of what that bird is scientifically, that we can identify it by wing bars or by plumage color or what it does with its tail or how it sings, but that ultimately we begin to develop some relationship with that bird. So while you're learning ornithology as the science, that you're also developing a personal ornithology of conscience. And that personal ornithology of conscience brings you closer to not thinking about what that bird is, but who that bird is. And that's not to anthropomorphize, that's not to give that bird human qualities, but to recognize, to maybe be with that bird for a while and to see it in a way that helps you understand it's not just something to count and put on a list, but it is something that you, an individual. So, I think about the hooded warbler that I mentioned, that I've heard, for 2 springs now, and I haven't individually marked that bird. So scientifically, I can't say with any confidence in any statistic that that's the same bird. But you also can't tell me it's not. So my mind says, wow, a hooded warbler is back. But then my personal ornithology shifts to say, the hooded warbler is back. And I see that bird and I think about it being maybe in Guyana or somewhere far removed from anywhere I've ever been. And so to get a student to that point, to get people to that point where they're saying, slow down and to say, oh, that bird has just recently flown across the Gulf of Mexico, 600 miles nonstop. That's heroic, right? And then it has battled storms and predators and all sorts of barriers that human beings put up. And it's here in my presence, and I'm looking at it through my binoculars. So I want the students, they identify the bird, then somehow they identify with the bird, but then to take their binoculars down. So if we're in a low country rice field, that they say, oh, this bird, wow, I'm watching these black-necked stilts, but wait a minute, this is a rice field. How did this get here? How did this habitat get here? It just didn't get here by itself. Oh, Doc said that this was where enslaved Africans were in this mud up to their waist sometimes doing this. So this is why this is here now. So those connections to bring, that servitude into this idea of not just past but present, because all of that marsh is still sequestering carbon at rates that may be higher than the forest that was originally there. But to think about how those black hands created this land in black mud that's supporting not just blackbirds, but all these blackbirds, but that has the capacity to support human life, wildlife. If people can make those connections in a class that I teach, then we've been successful. But then for all of the science that they learn, to have some personal relationship with birds or a bird that has, we use the term in birding, spark bird, right? But if they've had several sparks, because when you hit, that flint, you don't get just one spark, you get several. And so hopefully, we're sparking several things that enable them to feel some kind of way about birds so that they want to act to protect birds. But then they're also thinking about those birds and how they connect to human life, past, present, future.
I'm excited for watching.
Good.
Yeah, already. Well, we want to leave some time for question and answer. I know, that's what I was like, we're about to eat up all the question time, I know. So yeah, anybody who would like to ask any questions? Oh, your mic wasn't like, yeah, raise your hand.
I didn't know if you would read one of your poems.
Oh, sure. Do you have a request or?
Whichever one you like.
I'll read a short one. Let's see. Maybe I'll just open a page. Okay. Field Mark 3, wood thrush ID made simple. It's not so much about identifying what birds are as feeling who birds are. Head nods, jaw drops, smiles, tears, and abject adoration are all field marks for identifying the wood thrush, a brown-backed forest singing soul seldom seen, but more often heard and felt deeply. As this bird pumped its heart out in auto 3-part harmony, the one inside my own chest stopped beating for a while. So that was a bird. Thank you. That was a bird that sings, but it's every wood thrush that sings. It's every wood thrush that sings, that throws its song through somebody's window somewhere. And so one bird, in that case, spoke for every wood thrush that I've ever heard. And when I hear them, it means that I don't have to see them. Well, thank you for asking.
Thank you for doing that point, because I love the thrushes so much.
Thank you so much for this. This is really awesome and so thought-provoking. I actually have a question from the live stream. They wanted to know, what are your thoughts on using social media to connect people to nature? And are you on TikTok or Instagram?
Well, I'm all for it. And I'll tell you one of the things that, so y'all heard me talking earlier about curmudgeon me, right? And curmudgeon me initially back in the day, you know, when people were first carrying around those smartphones, you know, and you put that down, don't take that. And then, you know, part of what, I mean, there are great cameras on them, right? Recording devices. I started my field guides here. I will tell you that most of the writing that I do now is on my cell phone. It's, you know, 3,000 words is nothing. But the reason I say that, in you know, in that question about social media is, you've got all the tools that you need here to be a photographer, to be a writer, to communicate. And if, you know, if I publish a poem on a wood thrush that 300 people read, I'm really happy about that. If you publish a social media post that 3,000 people see, what complaint can I have? Right? So social media, I think used properly, it feels weird saying that, is an absolutely awesome leverage. It's a lever for words and thoughts. So I encourage people to use it as a tool. You know, maybe the estate tool of Tennessee, I don't know, since that's the latter, right? I learned that. But to use social media in a way to elevate. And there's some debate, you know, among writers and poets about, you know, you put stuff out there, and in some venues, they consider that publication, right? And they say, oh, well, once it was on social media, you can't publish it. But again, my thought is, my first, what I want to do as a writer is to get the word out that other people read. And if I'm waiting only on glossy publication to do that, then maybe people aren't getting a message that might in some way elevate or edify or inspire or inform. So yeah, I think there are ways to use it to really push things forward in ways that we can't do. And if we ignore that, then I think we're missing out on the opportunity. And yeah, I'm on IG at Wild and in Color. And I ain't gonna lie, TikTok. TikTok sort of scares me. So I just kind of watch like cat videos and stuff. I will not dance on TikTok. But I have birder friends who are there and who do absolutely marvelous things. My son-in-law does marvelous things. My daughter was doing, and then she told me how much time it took. I was like, that's a job. And I have several jobs already, so I'm not going to do that. But again, what I've found is that it allows me to get to a different group of folks who might not otherwise pick up a book, or they might pick up a book and maybe I'm feeling some kind of way someday, and I just put that out there, and it reaches them in a different way that nobody would ever publish in the pages of the book. So I think it's important.
Thank you.
Or whomever asked that question, thank you. Do you need to whisper?
Thank you for your sharing, for your talk. My question is, could you say a bit more about hunting? Your bio mentions your involvement in that, and particularly because of your comments on what it means to be a man of color, a Black man in the woods doing birding. And so I'm thinking about sort of the multiple kinds of vulnerability, but also like the relationships between terror and hope and possibility and mobility and immobility and all of that I think comes with experiencing the world in that way and hunting.
Thank you for that question. Great question. Hunting is both simple and complex, and I came to it late. My father hunted some, but mostly it was, like a change up in diet, and then suddenly we'd have rabbit for dinner, right? And so by the time I was old enough to sort of be around, Daddy wasn't hunting as much, but we were fishing a lot. And I always tell people that that avenue to being outside was important for me because, we just had this huge bass tournament in the upstate of South Carolina. And, people are catching all these fish and then they're putting them back. And I'm like, guess what? Our only catch and release was in a pan of grease. And that's subsistence. Right. And so, but people don't recognize that portion of the outdoors as much anymore, in part because it's not safe to eat fish from a lot of the waterways. So fishing is really kind of, underwater hunting in a way, but people don't give it the same sort of credence, I think. But it's really the statistics show, and if you want to see where diversity really comes into play, for me, it's getting to water and seeing all the different people who are fishing. Hunting has the complexity of a lethal weapon in killing. Well, fishing involves killing, but fish don't blink, so people don't think about it. They just chop fish's heads off without compunction. On the other hand, to kill another vertebrate, to me is not, I don't call it sport. You'll never hear me call hunting sport. You won't hear me talk about harvest. You'll hear me say kill, because when I hunt deer, my objective is to kill an animal that I can eat. It's not sport. Now, the deer outsmart me 9 out of 10 times. I get lucky about 1 out of every 10. And so, in that, what I owe that animal for its life is to eat it. And that's, if I'm not going to eat it, then I'm not going to kill it. So, that's part of the personal motivation. And and I've let it be known that hopefully after I'm gone, that my ashes are spread somewhere in the forest that helps to grow oaks that produce acorns that then become deer. And I'm serious about that. But the complexities of it, of being in the woods, and you mentioned this earlier, are, Black person armed and in the woods. And one of the curious things I found out in some of my research as I write this book, that back in 1908, the Audubon Society of South Carolina did one of its first reports. It was the first annual report on bird life in South Carolina. And what the ornithologists were reporting were declines in certain birds. But one of the things that they mentioned several times, and I found other references to this, was how Negroes loitering in the fields were killing all these birds. Even as they mentioned this one white hunter who was used to killing over 1,000 wood ducks a year, was angry because he was only now killing hundreds of wood ducks a year. And that Negroes wandering around were killing all these birds and killing quail. And they went on further to say that part of the way to remedy this essentially was licensure, right? Fees, which would ultimately take opportunity and guns out of the hands of Negroes. So, there's a social complexity to a Black person walking around with a gun. And it's going to be interesting to see what the reaction is because the people who are arming themselves most rapidly in this country are Black folks. Black women at very high rates. Yet I haven't heard certain 3-letter organizations log that, beginning with N and ending with A. I think they're probably fighting other lawsuits at the present time. But I think for me as a hunter, I go into the woods with a certain amount of trepidation. It used to be that I went in, not with the same amount, but in a hunt club that I was in, I had someone tell me, because they hadn't seen me, and it's the hunt club members often don't see, and I wasn't making the social events, but I made one of these social events, and he introduced himself, and he was nice enough, and he said, I'm glad I met you, because if we had been up there and I had just seen you wandering around, he said, I might have drawn down on you. Now I'm the only Black member of this hunt club. Was. And this dude was a former policeman. And he's telling me I might have, and I stood there, I said, excuse me? He said, well, yeah, it's all good now, I know you, and blah, 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 blah. The hunt club did get rid of him, to their credit. They expunged him. They got rid of him that year. But see, accidents happen in the woods all the time. Accidents happen in the woods all the time. And all I could think about at that point in time when this dude told me that was, I would have drawn down on you. Have I been in your sights? So again, that's another, I can't just go into the woods. Look, I would go walk to my stand early in the morning before light and come out and here I am walking in the dark, which it takes a bit of practice to do, walking in the dark, and there are more bears in that part of the country than deer. And I come out of my stand, and I remember walking out one day, and sometimes, there'd be a coyote track here and there that come in on top of your track. But I'm leaving one day, and there's these bear tracks right alongside mine, right? Some on top of my track. And I didn't feel threatened, I felt alive. But this dude was more threatening than any bear could have ever been. He changed my perception of that hunt club, those people, and so I got out of that hunt club. And then thought something about those people who chose to remain in it after hearing that. Now they got rid of him, but so those are the complexities of being a Black hunter, somebody who's going to go afield armed and into a situation where somebody can see you, say, oh, I thought you were, or I thought he was a deer, I'm so sorry. So I think about that a lot. And I've had to change my practice and how I go about hunting, right? I usually go with a buddy. Most frequently a white buddy. You know, it's no different than I told a friend years ago who wanted to see a bird in a yard in a section of Buckhead that wasn't so black. He wanted to see this bird, and he called me and asked me, man, I want to go see this bird. I said, where is it? And he told me, I said, isn't that? He said, yeah. I said, well, phone a friend, a white friend, and then you can go. But I would not just go by myself. So that's part of the practice in learning, the history and, and what the danger, but then also the personal experience of that one person telling me. And now I understand it was a threat. At the time I was like, am I hearing this? You would draw down on me, not being threatened, but just because you see I'm different and out there and you may not know me. So that year, I think I went hunting. Anytime I went hunting, my buddy was always with me. And I was out of that club the next year because I just wasn't gonna, I wasn't gonna subject myself to that same sort of mentality or the echoes of that mentality. So thank you did I answer your question at all? Yeah. That's envy to sleep like that. Of course, that won't happen tonight.
So I have a question.
Yes.
Thank you for all of this, sitting with it throughout the session. And a lot of things are resonating with me. And I'm wondering though, if you can talk more about navigation and what we can learn from birds about navigation. I think there's a few things you said that, resonated. Thinking through how birds themselves navigate and travel and traverse, and what they rely on, their own natural systems, and also how we in the past, I think you gave the example of Harry Tubman using the Barnett Owl. Just wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about birds and how we can lean on them, or what we can learn from them about navigation.
Sure. We're learning more and more about how birds navigate, in sort of what their brains do and tell them, and sort of all the tools that they have physiologically to do what they do, which is inspiring. And still, we can never know, right? So, the bird that comes down into my backyard, how did you make that decision? Or wherever it is that you decide to come down, well, it could be just exhaustion. I've been on the Gulf Coast and watched birds barely come in above the waves because they've been flying all night. From, they jumped off the Yucatan maybe. And, some of those birds island hop. They hop off the Yucatan and then they're to Cuba, and then they're up the chain, up the Florida Peninsula and come up. And in some ways, that might be an easier trip, but then lots of those birds are flying straight across the Gulf. And to see that bird, and this was a Baltimore Oriole that was coming in. And so that bird had navigated to that point. And I don't mean in any way to, demean the quote unquote greatest generation or whatever, but all I could think about is this bird made the beach. And now it's got to deal not only with predators, you know, the falcon or the sharp-shinned hawk, or that can sort of take it out naturally. And now it's got to worry about somebody's cat that can end this heroic journey. Now it's got to worry about flying into plate glass like it would on this campus or my campus. Now it's got to worry about habitat being destroyed. Now it's got to worry about all these things. So that bird has to navigate through all of that. And then if it's the wood thrush, for example, that I hear singing, in that song, that bird is harmonizing with itself. That's part of what a bird's syrinx allows it to do. I'm thinking about that wood thrush and like, that bird, that wood thrush made it from Guatemala to be in these woods. It navigated not only oceans and landscapes, but all of these obstacles, and here it is. So that's again another lesson in navigating, I mean, life writ large, and how we think about getting to the place where we can sing. Well, one of the keys is that wood thrush doesn't wait just until it gets on territory to sing. When it finds a place where it can rest, it can feed, it can refuel, it's singing. So we have to find opportunities to sing as we go. And for all the science that we can know about a bird, there again is that aspect that we can't know. So we can talk about, you know, as it reaches the place where it wants or needs to be, what its hormonal titers are, and the habitat quality is just right, and that bird sets up this territory. But what it does in the in-between is just as important as what it does when it reaches that apex. So that navigation is something that I think about all the time. There's a painting by an artist named Charlie Harper. He's dead now, but Charlie Harper was this minimalist painter who used really geometric form to sort of express, and he's done just all kinds of stuff. He's gotten really very popular here in the last decade or so. But there's a painting called Mystery of the Missing Migrants that inspires me, and it's this melange of different birds, warblers, thrushes, a cuckoo with his tail sort of flipped around, a swallowtail kite. You know, swallowtail kites are primarily diurnal migrants, I think. But all these birds against this blue sky that's pinpricked with yellow stars, and there are palm trees beneath it. And every time I see that art, I think about the wonder of this river of birds above our heads as we dream at night. And if you're someplace quiet, you can hear them. And to hear a thrush, or to hear some chip note, and you're like, it's happening. These birds are doing it again. But it's 3 billion less birds than it was 50 years ago when Marvin, you know, year after the ecology was written. So again, their navigation through not just space, but through time is such an inspiring thing to me, that I think the sort of the spirit of it hits me as hard as the science of it. Because again, you know, they've been doing this for a very, very, very long time, and we're doing our best to snuff it out. And that's what I call, you know, I mean, that's just wrong. It's so to that navigation, now they got to navigate through our attitudes that are as dangerous as any cat or plate glass They got to navigate through our callousness. They got to navigate through our selfishness. They got to navigate through all the stuff that we would throw up because we just got beyond ourselves. So, me included. So it is during COVID, sitting in the backyard watching rose-breasted grosbeaks come through, and watching rose-breasted grosbeaks deliver the world to me, or the scarlet tanager that was in the red mulberry tree. That morning, that scarlet tanager was in that red mulberry tree. I didn't say it was a scarlet. I said, oh, the scarlet tanager is back. And watching that bird at the top of that red mulberry tree just sing his guts out. That's how I got through COVID personally. That bird had navigated and found that red mulberry. And for maybe a week, it would sing from that red mulberry about the same time every morning. And I would watch it at the top, singing like a shaft of rising sun. And it was like a firebird. So, in my opinion, it had navigated its way into me. So, I want to know as much as I can about how they do it, why they do it. But then again, what I don't know and what I imagine is as important to me now as the data that I can get otherwise. So, but there's all sorts of stuff out there to read about how birds navigate. I mean, some birds are navigating by smell in part. That's amazing, right? Star compass. Ability to discern the magnetic fields, to see polarized light. All of that combined, I mean, that's just stuff that we can't do. So not that I'm not into Batman, but my birds have much bigger capes and tool belts that they can do super heroic things. And so every time I think about it, again, it just inspires me. But it also, to know that there are so many fewer birds, and to know that there are things that we could do to help that we don't do, that's sort of saddening. So we got to navigate our own kind of thing too. But thank you for asking that.
And with that one, I like having my own microphone, I can just interject myself. And with that, we will stop this. So I would encourage you guys to check out Drew on all the social medias and buy his book in the back, home place if you want. Also, the Sierra Club has banners up of the Holston River up in the library. If you're heading that way, you can go get a coffee and check out the banners and get materials from Sierra Club. And this podcast episode will probably be available in the summertime, late summer. And yeah, so let's give a hand to Drew.